Racial inequality is a result of deliberate choice. It is the country we made. If we're going to resolve it, we have to be just as deliberate.
That call to action from Princeton professor Eddie Glaude puts into stark focus our challenge to purge systemic racism from America's soul. Today, we welcome four distinguished guests to talk about how we can confront the racism that's subverting our democracy. Joining us are Roxane Gay, critically acclaimed author of 5 books and New York Times columnist. Ibram X. Kendi, historian and best-selling author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. Imani Perry, author, columnist for The Atlantic, and Princeton University professor. And Ali Velshi, journalist and host of Velshi on MSNBC. We're not only thrilled, we are honored to have all of you with us today. Ibram, I'm going to start with you. 4 years ago, you wrote a piece in The Atlantic called A House Still Divided. And then you said basically that the threat of racism was as existential as it was before the Civil War. Now, 2 years ago, it looked like in the wake of George Floyd's murder, we were actually having a moment of inflection. We were at a point of racial reckoning, and then things seemed to sort of fade a bit. So as of today, how do you characterize how divided our House still is?
Well, first, let me just say I'm so glad to be a part of this conversation with these intellectuals who I admire. So we're at a point that I think is quite similar to those days before the murder of George Floyd, in which you had people who thought of and recognized really racism as an existential threat to the American Republic. And then you had others who were imagining that those who were fighting against racism, who were trying to create equity and justice for all, were actually the existential threat. And so I don't think we could be more divided. And you referenced the Civil War. Before the Civil War, enslavers considered abolitionists to be the existential threat, just as those abolitionists recognized those enslavers. And I think we're at a similar point today.
Roxane, you had written a piece 2 years ago after the election of President Biden in which you said that we're living in two countries, that one country is trying to grapple with racism, and the other one is propping up, supporting, promoting white supremacy. Now, where do you think we are today?
I think we're in the exact same place we were 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago. For every instance of progress, we seem to have a retrenchment of some kind. And I think that is always the case when you challenge power structures. And when we demand an end to things like police brutality and voter disenfranchisement and all of the issues that people in communities of color are facing, what we're doing is saying it's time for something to change. And of course, people who hold power are often incredibly resistant to change.
What about that moment after George Floyd's murder where it seemed that there was a groundswell and Black Lives Matter was emerging and evolving, and it was exciting and people were protesting? What happened to that?
I think that change requires more than the energy required in a moment. It is something that has to be sustained, and it's really hard to sustain revolutionary energy while you're also trying to live your lives. And I think a lot of times people forget our memory, our cultural memory in particular, is incredibly short. And so it was a moment, and like many, I'm not an optimist, but I did think, okay, now we're here. Now we're ready to make the change. Now something is going to happen. But alas, it has not yet been the change that we really need to see.
Carrying on with you, Ali, with trying to get an overview, a big picture. You say famously that unlike former President Barack Obama, you are a Muslim and you were born in Kenya.
And he was never at any of the meetings.
You grew up with your parents in South Africa and witnessed the worst of apartheid, of segregation. So you're obviously, different perspective. But in terms of where you think we are right now, in pursuing racial justice. What's your take?
Look, so much of what I've learned about this has been from my other colleagues here on the stage. These are people I've had on to discuss these issues. But I went out into the country after George Floyd's death, and I will say I think there's been a little progress. And that progress is the idea that really good people definitely had in their mind that people don't get pulled over by police and lynched if they weren't doing anything, or certainly weren't doing anything to deserve that. So there was a moment in which there was a bit of a switch. But racism is an addiction, right? It's like being addicted to a drug, or it's like being addicted to alcohol. You're never going to be done with it. You actually have to keep on working at being done with it. And the fact that the moment passed meant that a whole bunch of people have said to themselves, I understand that was racist. I understand a lot of these police killings were racist. I understand a lot of things going on in America are racist. But I think I'm good that I understand that, and now life goes on, as Roxanne says. That's the difficulty. The revolutionary change needed to overcome systemic racism is going to be a lot of energy, and we aren't at a place where we have to feel that energy yet as a country.
Imani, your father, your adoptive father, was a white Jewish activist who believed in Black liberation. And after he died, you were watching a speech of him in which he quoted the extraordinary playwright Lorraine Hansberry. And he talked about how unless you really can understand the true nature of a problem, you can't start to solve it. And this is where we sort of segue into, does America really even know what the problem is?
I think it depends on who you're speaking of. There are certainly some people who know. I think there's something to be learned from the intensity of the backlash in the present moment to the progress that came with that moment of reckoning, and how much of the backlash is anti-intellectual. You know, this interest in preventing people from reading, from knowing, from having sources of information, combined with an anti-democratic sensibility, is really instructive, because it's hard to get people to sustain a belief in hierarchies of human beings and the idea of inferiority when they actually understand how inequality has been structured, how it's been baked into the society, how it has been sustained. And so for me, the challenge of this moment is to sustain a commitment to people knowing, right? To spread the information that we gather, to share knowledge, to remain committed despite all of the efforts to shut off knowledge and understanding, to really build the promise of democracy and deep inclusion and multiracialism.
But Ibram, getting back to how we tell our story, now we have a whole movement, a whole campaign to derail teaching race, racism, slavery, anything that's perceived to be what's been called divisive concept in schools. And you've got 36 states that have passed laws that in some way limit how those things are taught. Now, you know, a war on history is a war on democracy. How do we pull back from that? It seems like the momentum for that sort of activity is building.
Well, I think we pull back from that by organizing, by ensuring that people who are in positions of power to select books, to determine curriculums, are people who are committed to the truth, are people who are committed to research and science, are people who recognize racial equality, are people who recognize that racism is the cause of disparities and injustices, not what's wrong with particular groups, are people who recognize that one of the ways in which we come together as different peoples is recognizing our shared humanity. Like those are the types of folks we need in positions of power.
But that's not necessarily who we have in positions of power. Allie's smiling, but you know, you're dealing with, go ahead.
Well, I think the issue is we've discussed the energy for revolution, we've discussed protest, but this has to translate into the watering of the garden of democracy, right? That's the problem. Democracy, in my opinion, doesn't take a ton of work, but it takes some work. it does actually mean running for school board, office, or attending the school board meetings, or going to the school meetings. Democracy, it looks like it's broken at this level, and there are all sorts of reasons why that's a valid way to look at things, and that's happening in lots of places around the world. But democracy starts getting broken at a very, very basic level, at a very low level. So we have to take that energy and that protest and that revolution that we saw a few years ago, and it needs to translate into citizenship and civic action. And that's a harder one to sustain. We've got to get people to say, I'm going to fix this, and I'm going to put myself on the line to fix it. We have to accept that we are all in the arena now. We're not on the sidelines watching this. Democracy is ours to save.
But as columnist Charles Blow has said, he's really come to not expect so much anymore from Americans who seem to have a deep yearning for change, but a shallow appetite for actually delivering it. Now, Roxanne, you talk about something that I think doesn't often get spoken about, white fragility. Okay. Well, we're going to speak about it right now because I want to put a quote up on the screen that I picked out. Basically, there is no greater identity politics than that of white people trying to build a firewall around what remains of their empire as the country's demographics continue to shift. Go ahead.
Yeah, I said it.
Okay. Okay. But at the heart of this issue of trying to suppress information to children, to teach them what happened in the history, how we tell our story, where does this white fragility come into play?
Well, it comes into play because people want to protect their children from difficult truths, not only about enslavement, but also the Holocaust. There's a lot of denial of the atrocities that humans are capable of committing. And it seems that it is primarily white children that communities want to protect from these realities. And it's also a really interesting, in a bad way, revisionism of history and this idea that enslavement wasn't so bad, which is something we see in states like Texas and Georgia, where the state school boards are the people who determine the textbooks, are always finding ways to insert ahistorical information into what should be factual textbooks. And so really we have to call this what it is, which is white fragility and white people's inability to tolerate discomfort in any way for any amount of time.
And what do we do about it?
Well, I don't know what we do about it. But
good answer, Roxanne.
This is something that white people have to be in community with one another over. And like, you guys have to fix yourselves because there's nothing people of color can do that we have not already done. White people have to decide to face reality and accept, okay, this was the past, and we should do everything in our power to not let history repeat itself.
I think something that's interesting here is that if it were looked at, if what Roxanne is talking about were looked at as accountability as opposed to blame. See, a lot of people say, I don't want to take the blame for this. I didn't do that. I didn't have slaves. My people didn't have slaves. I'm immigrants from, 20 years ago or whatever. It's this idea that just take accountability for the power you hold. You don't have to be blamed for it. You don't have to take blame for it. But if you hold that power, disproportionate power in society, just be accountable for it and fix it.
You're talking about how it's framed.
I think it's how it's received. I think that's how people have to think about it. So when Roxanne says white people have to fix themselves, you don't ever have to accept blame for it. You can just say, I actually hold more power than other people do in society, and I'm going to actively fix that. And I think we've seen it with a lot of people as they saw Black Lives Matter. I think we saw it with a lot of people as they went through Me Too. They said, I don't have to accept blame for something I didn't do, but I do have to accept ownership for the fact that I have a better position in society by virtue of being a man or being white or whatever the case is.
Amani, the subject of your latest book is the South, and to hear you tell it, Amani, everything starts in the South, but you're trying to have people take another look at how, if you understand the South, you can understand racism better, you can understand democracy better. Why does it all start in the South?
It literally begins there. The project of the nation begins there, and the intersection of this sort of vision of empire and the willingness to take people's land and to have some folks be unfree laborers to exploit the land is at the, in many ways, that's the origin point of the country. But you also have in that place people who lived incredibly vulnerable lives and had these extraordinarily beautiful freedom dreams and ignited the imagination not only of the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And I just wanted to go back for a moment to the point about white children, because I think it's also really key that we recognize that part of what's happening is a cutting off of the moral imaginations of white children. There's nothing that says that they cannot identify with the freedom struggles of people of color, that they can't be inspired by them. So this effort to limit the stories that they have access to is actually to limit their ability to empathize, to limit their imaginations of who they might be. It also is not just limiting the stories of oppression and violence and degradation, but also of the beauty and glory of communities of color, of queer communities, of disabled people, and on and on. So this idea that, and it sustains the idea that only certain people matter, right? And so for me, telling the story of the South is telling the fullness of that story, right? The ugliness, the violence, the exploitation, but also the resistance, the resilience, the integrity, the moral imagination. And I think it's really important to remain committed to that as an accurate rendering of our national history.
But the South very often is seen as the problem area. It's like that's where it all. So it's not about me. I live in Minnesota. It's not about me. I live in Maine. You know what I'm saying? It's like it's sort of
absolutely.
It lets some other people feel off the hook in terms of responsibility. Talk about that.
Sure. I mean, the South functions as the repository for the nation's sins, as though the entire nation didn't build its wealth off of the unfree labor that took place in the South. Cotton as king made this country wealthy. Wall Street began as a slave market. DC is in the South because of the power of the Virginia planters. So many of our first presidents. I mean, it is the conditions of the South have moved the country about, so when we talk about the way Walmart has taken over not only the country, but the world, right? That's a Southern story. When we talk about oil and how it has shaped both international politics, but also our environment, that begins as a Southern story. So to push the sins of the country off on the South is actually a refusal to look in the mirror about who we are.
Your colleague, Amani, Professor Eddie Glaude, who we've been honored to have on this show in the past, talks about the myths and the legends. I want to talk about, Ibram, that a little bit in terms of how do you think they derail people's understanding? I want to get back to, again, why we can't tell the story of America's history.
If you've been taught this myth that there was a time in which Black people were enslaved and white people freed them, there was a reversal to Jim Crow, but then white people freed Black people from segregation, and equality arrived in the 1960s, or certainly with the election of Barack Obama, and that equality was destined. So it's not necessarily something that we have to even do. That racial progress is the story of America. If you've been taught that myth, that it pacifies you. It allows you to imagine not only that white people have freed Black people time and again, but allows you to imagine that the strength of America has strengthened those white folks. And it's all a myth.
There are very real obstacles getting, past the myth and the legends right now. The erosion of our rights in this country, voter suppression, Allie, hundreds of bills, laws working their ways through state legislatures to basically make it harder for people to vote.
Right.
But again, the target, people of color.
That's right.
So we talk about getting interested in electing people at the state level. But people don't often make that connection. They don't.
They don't.
Yeah.
And they show up in smaller numbers to vote in local elections and state elections than they do in very exciting presidential elections. I would say that what Ibram said about myths that pacify people apply to voters' rights as well. For those of us who don't have to wait in line, who don't have issues with providing ID, it becomes an abstraction that people in Georgia have to wait in line for a long time, and it's actually illegal to provide them with water if they've been in a line for 10 or 12 hours. It's an abstraction that in certain counties in Texas, you have to drive for a very long time to go to vote. They're interesting. We like to think that everybody's got equal rights to vote, but the fact is we don't feel it until we feel it, and that's the wrong way to look at democracy. It's the same thing with Roe v. Wade, right? If your ability to have an abortion is not impacted by the decision, it's a right that's been taken away, and your democracy is imperfect until it is. So these stories are all connected. As long as everybody can keep them as abstractions, as long as voter rights over here and abortion rights over here and racism over there makes you believe that you're not the problem, you just sit back, go about your lives, worry about gas prices and inflation. The fact is, democracy is imperfect until we deal with all of these things. We may never get it right, but we've got to look like and feel like we're on an actual trajectory to solving some of these very obvious problems.
But when you see rights being stripped, a 50-year-old right being stripped away in the reversal of Roe, I mean, it feels like we're going backwards. And now you see what's happened with Roe, and you see how it disproportionately affects women of color. I mean, aren't we going backwards?
Some of us are going backwards, yes. And it's incredibly alarming. You know, a lot of us who are feminists did not think Roe would be overturned, but abortion activists and reproductive freedom activists have been ringing this alarm for quite some time. And I think a lot of people got incredibly complacent and decided that Roe was law, and a surprising number of people believed the most recent Supreme Court justices when they lied under oath and said that they would not be invested in overturning Roe. And so we are moving backwards, but it doesn't mean that it has to be a permanent shift of progress. I think that especially when elections come up, we have to show up and let our legislators know that indeed having access to abortion is the will of pretty much the majority of this country. And we have to do more than vote, because a lot of times online when people are getting riled up, they'll say vote. But frankly, the people you're talking to are already voting. And so we have to remember that it is our civic responsibility to be engaged in our communities every single day, and not just once every 2 to 4 years or more if you are an active voter.
If I can, because it just makes me feel really smart to follow up on anything Roxanne says. And, not only do most people support the right to reproductive freedom, most people support action on climate change, most people support gun control, most people support having everybody be allowed to vote. Most people do. So when we say, are we going backwards, actually most of us are not. Most of us are moving forward. Something's going on in these legislatures and in Washington that's causing people to go backward. But it is really important for everybody to understand, those of us who are foot soldiers for democracy, and that's everybody, no matter what political stripe you're of, most of us are moving forward. We're going to have to grab everybody and have the governments of this country come with us, because most people's sentiment in this country is in the right place on all of these issues.
Amani, you know, there was a recent poll released by the Public Religion Research Institute, Robert Jones, talking about how the group that feels the most strongly about whites as victims are evangelical Christians. And you're smiling, but the disparity between white Republicans, 87%, would still like to see the Confederacy promoted and talked about, and again, see themselves as victims, as opposed to 23% of white Democrats. Now, you can legislate some things, but I don't know, how do you start to deal with that sort of discrimination?
I mean, I think it's important to understand very explicitly that, you know, white evangelicals constructed a political order underneath within a theology. And that at the moment when it was clear that the battle against civil rights, the battle against desegregation was lost, there was a pivoting. Was pivoting to organizing around anti-abortion. And so there is a tight connection between that theology and the history of segregation and racial inequality and a variety of other forms of bigotry. I think the point, though, that Roxanne made is really important to emphasize, that there are people who have been ringing the alarms, as it were, and many of them are organizers coming out of the South, think are models for doing what Ali pointed out, which is to actually engage every day in the work of democracy, to understand that you actually can't take a day off. This is not a matter simply of voting. It's actually a matter of trying to shift the culture, to transform people's minds and hearts, frankly.
Okay, but something, Ibram, for example, I know you're a big proponent of changing policies. You think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that that's really where the onus of work has to happen, that this is about to try and root out systemic racism has to do with better policies. And it's not so much about changing people. Is that basically what you think?
Well, part of the challenge is when you are trying to change the minds of people who are being fed consistently and constantly these ideas that the source of their pain are those other people who don't look like them or live near them or worship like them. It's very hard to convince them otherwise. But one way you can convince them otherwise is by actually changing the very economic and social conditions and political conditions they're living under. And then once they recognize that the source of their pain weren't those people who look like them, you're actually much more likely to change them. And so that's why historically social movements, power shifts, and policies have actually been much more likely to change people, than us going around and trying to get people to see that we're all equals.
But when you're talking about something like domestic violent extremism, which is the single greatest threat from within to this country, and it's all about white supremacy and it's all about hate crimes, and somebody picks up, an assault rifle and walks into a supermarket in Buffalo, New York, and murders 10 African Americans, how do you have policies root out that sort of hatred?
We live in a country with 400 million guns. And we also live in a country where there's this constant and consistent rhetoric where people are told, again, that the source of their pain are those other people who don't look like them. And so that's a very combustible situation. So, and I think we have to really think deeply about getting rid of one of them. And certainly one of the things we can get rid of, are all those guns.
I think Ibram's onto something here with respect to the narrative that people have about who they can blame. Remember, the domestic white extremism in this country was born out of an alt-right movement, which was a whole bunch of disparate people who were mad about different things, right? Some people didn't like Asians getting into university. Some people didn't like women taking their jobs. Some people didn't like immigrants and refugees. Some people didn't like black people. And the internet brought them all together. Social media has wrecked our minds and damaged our ability to be critical thinkers. So they have been given a narrative, and the narrative is not the one they believe it is, that it's immigrants and blacks and gays and Asians. The narrative should be, you're blaming the wrong people. Ibram's right. If we actually redirected people's energies to bad policies that keep them in economic serfdom, then you start to think, oh, it's not the immigrants, it's not the gays, it's not the Chinese, it's actually our own governments that want us to be a working, productive people all the time to serve the needs of a strong economic system. We have to actually change that. We have to give people the opportunities that they need so that they stop blaming the wrong people. That's a very, very heavy lift. Jane.
Well,
It's a very heavy lift.
especially in this time when the culture wars, Roxanne, and
Yes.
you've taught the weaponization of the other.
Yes.
People
All over the world.
Again, you're right, all over the world. But talking about right here, in the last, I think, any number of years, this has escalated. It all goes together, the hate crimes, the domestic violent extremism, it's all tied together. Social media may throw the gasoline on the situation, but talk about people, the weaponization of other people, basically.
Well, really, it's the weaponization of difference because it's an easy wedge to create problems, to create discord, and to make people who already feel disenfranchised feel justified in that. Ali was speaking earlier about accountability, and that's so true. And one of the things that gets lost in so many of these conversations is that you can acknowledge that you hold power in some ways and still suffer. You can still experience hardship. What people tend to term culture wars is that there are people who are marginalized who would like equality and equity and like human rights. And all of a sudden that becomes a culture war, as if we're trying to foist certain types of identity on other people, when in fact it's no, I would like to be able to live freely and openly and safely and not have to worry about the integrity of my marriage and whether or not this new Supreme Court is going to overturn it. So if that's a war, yes, but let's admit what the terms of engagement actually are.
Imani, you've also talked about the culture wars and how detrimental they can be to all of us. What do you have to say about them?
Yeah, I think, I'm a movement baby, and so I believe deeply in the processes of acquiring knowledge and political education. And I do think that there is an intense effort to control what people know in an effort to control how people think, as opposed to sort of this equivocation that happens with culture wars, as though there's just two sides. And then that tends towards us thinking, well, we have to wind up somewhere in the middle. We need to think about the side that is actually oriented towards the fuller, deeper, more robust story, and those who want people to continue to believe in mythologies that were put in place in order to sustain various forms of domination and inequality. I think we have to make it plain that those are the stakes of the two positions.
I was going to say, I think we need a little bit of, I won't go to optimism, Roxanne. There have been some positive developments that have come out in the last couple of years. And I know, Ali, that you were in Jackson, Mississippi. You went down there to talk to students and teachers and about the sort of danger of, again, the lies of not telling the truth about who we are. And there was a young man you interviewed named Timothy. And do you know who I'm talking about? And I knew you would. And he basically said the problem is we don't stand in our own truth.
Yes.
And talk about that.
I'm sort of, first of all, blown away by how you know all this stuff. There's no prompter, there's no notes, how you
it's
remember.
All in my head.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, there were these students who had grown up in Tougaloo, in Jackson, Mississippi, and had gone to Tougaloo College, the historically black college, and they were saying, "Wow, you come up in the public education system in Jackson, Mississippi, and you hear about a new Confederate hero every week, and then in Black History Month, you hear about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and like one other person." And then you go to these historically black colleges and universities and you learn that there are lots of people, there are lots of heroes all the time in the climate movement and all sorts of movement who were black. And it empowers you, right? It makes you realize that myth that Ibram was talking about isn't true, because the myth doesn't just get taught to white kids, gets taught to black kids, gets taught to everybody. Right. And a lot of black parents and grandparents and great-grandparents didn't want to inculcate their kids with what is sometimes thought of to some people as a shameful history, something to be embarrassed about. So we really do have to live in our own history. And to Imani's point, in the South, they do struggle with that. In Alabama and Mississippi and places like that, they really struggle with telling real stories about what the war was, what the Civil War was, what it was about. And white kids and black kids learn different things there. And sometimes black kids have to go outside of the circle of public education to get the full story. So we are not living in our own truth. We're not living in a shared experience. If we all were in this country, our prospects for progress would be better. And in moments like George Floyd's murder, not everybody looked at that video and saw the same thing, but many people looked at that video and for the first time saw something that they hadn't seen before. They saw a lynching. They saw the fact that a guy got killed. It was adjudicated and carried out with cameras rolling and impunity. That did change hearts and minds. It didn't change the system, but by the way, there was accountability for that in the end. It was not justice. Justice is George Floyd not being dead. Justice is people not having that happen to them. But police were actually held accountable. And we saw that. We've seen it a couple of times since. That's actually meaningful change. It's not the whole ball game, but it is actually meaningful change.
Then, not to bring it down again, but then the stats on how many people of color have been killed since George Floyd have just continue to go up.
The facts on the ground may change more slowly than the minds. Right? The idea is if we can get minds to change, those minds lead to voting, those minds lead to change. This is a very, very slow process. But in Philadelphia, even the cops suggested the idea that how about we not pull people over for traffic violation, not traffic, but like if your tail light is out or your
right.
light, they've got a way to know who you are because we have computers now, and they will send you a ticket. It doesn't solve the problem, but it reduces the chance that someone's going to get pulled over and killed. Because if you're black in this country and you get pulled over, the statistical chances of you ending up dead are substantially higher than any white person will ever experience in this country. Stuff like that is getting out there, and that will help change.
But then we get back, Roxanne, to this whole notion, you're living in a post-truth culture. You're living in a culture where people can't even agree on a common set of facts. I mean, it's not about disagreeing anymore. It's about we don't have the same facts. So how do we reconcile that in terms of this conversation?
I don't know that we do, but I do think we have to stop legitimizing people who don't believe in facts and treating it as a valid point of view, because it simply isn't. And increasingly in my work, I'm not going to engage with people who are racist. That's not a valid point of view. And so the more that we continue to demand that we speak truthfully, that we traffic in facts, the better off we're all going to be. And it's important to call out afactual information whenever we see it. And it can be uncomfortable at times. And so we have to continue to call it out. We have to treat it for the problem, for the scourge that it is. And we have to remember that just because people say that certain factual elements of our history are not real, will never, ever make it so. And we should not ever let people who don't believe in honesty and truth have control of our cultural narrative.
Do you actually call people? I mean, I know
Yes,
you're very okay. I'm not doubting you, Roxanne.
No,
but
I'm actually quiet and shy in my day-to-day life.
I know,
but I absolutely, when I can and where I can, believe in calling it out, because that kind of creep of misinformation is so dangerous. We have to hold the line of truth. And when people try to treat truth as subjective, no, you don't get to do that.
Amani, because you're such a gentle soul, I'll ask you the same question. I'm sure you're feisty, but you don't strike me as somebody who might necessarily be confrontational in the sense that I'm, really? Okay, underestimated her. Do you call people out when they're just off in terms of facts?
Absolutely.
You do?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and that's how I was socialized. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. I was born 9 years after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. There's a real cost that I and people in my family know intimately to all of these lies. And so I think that you respond to them directly and firmly. And we can't concede the terms of the conversation. I think it's simply an untenable proposition. It's too, our lives are too important for that. So yes, I think you call it out and then you substantiate it with information. Look, there are literally billions of facts in the world, right? And when we tell stories of who we are, we pull out from those facts in order to craft a narrative, and that narrative that we craft is a reflection of our values.
Ibram, I was surprised to read that you actually had to overcome some racist thinking yourself.
To be born in the United States, even as a Black person, is to be constantly told you're the problem. You're told the same histories and the same narratives, uh, the same ideas of Black inferiority as white children. I came of age, particularly as a teenager in the 1990s, and that was a moment in which Black teens were constantly rendered the American problem. We were called a menace to society. We were called super predators. It was imagined that Black girls were, quote, having too many babies to get more welfare. There were all these ideas of anti-Blackness constantly circulating around Black children. We were even told that we were killing or not honoring King's dream. It was constant and regular. And it just really shows the perniciousness and the pervasiveness, of these ideas. And I think one thing that Roxanne stated that I think is incredibly important is how vulnerable young people are to these ideas. And we have this movement not to figure out ways to protect our children from that form of bigotry, but there's this mass movement to pull books on people of color and women and trans kids out of the hands of our children that will actually protect them from those ideas. That's the moment we're living in.
Amani, you work with young people, and Ibram brings up the point that they're very vulnerable, susceptible to everything, this culture. It's just this blur, this tsunami that's going on around us. What is your sort of sense of their sense of the future in terms of if they're young people of color?
The young people in my life talk precisely about what both Ibram and Roxanne have talked about, all of these mechanisms in which people are being socialized into various forms of bigotry, frequently through online sources. But I wouldn't say that I think that the young people I'm around are pessimistic. They seem to have a very clear sense that they have a responsibility to build the future that they want. In many ways, they have a sensibility that is not unlike that of my mother's generation, the civil rights generation, which makes sense because they lived through scenes of horror that were not unlike that generation's encounter with scenes of horror, seeing Black people, unarmed Black people shot dead in the street without remedy over and over again. And so I think there's a sense of responsibility and incredible courage.
Roxanne, we're getting to the point in the broadcast where we're literally sort of going to wind down and talk about some of the things we've talked about that could be done that would be positive. What would be on your list of things that you think for people to take away today after watching this?
That's a good question. I think that despite all of the challenges that we're currently facing as a culture, there are reasons to be, if not optimistic, at least have a positive outlook. And, as Imani notes, this younger generation is incredible, and they really do have this sense that, if you're not going to fix it, we're going to go ahead and try. And I think that it's incredibly admirable. Just last week in Virginia, hundreds, if not thousands, of school children walked out because of what their Governor Youngkin's policies about trans kids have done in response to just transphobia. And it was incredible. And it really was a reminder that sometimes the gestures that we think are symbolic mean something. Like, there's a reason why we look to symbols as a culture, and it was so much more than symbolic.
I heard the young person who had organized that that initiative, and she was incredibly inspiring and articulate, and I think we should run her for something as soon as she's old enough, which gets me to the point of, we recently talked to Reshma Saujani, who, as you know, is the founder of Girls Who Code, and I asked her about young people voting, because frankly, young people don't have a terrific, let's be honest, track record of voting. And she said, oh, no, they work outside, they do other things that'll circumvent and be just as productive. But the voting thing, if you're working within a system that has to be changed, is that something that is ever talked about as important?
Well, of course, but the reality is that we haven't given them any candidates worth voting for. So is it shocking that they're not going to vote? I'm sorry, but we cannot seem to field a candidate in any party under the age of 70. And that's certainly not an insult to people over the age of 70, because I'm heading right there. It's more that we don't seem to understand the importance of looking beyond the traditional ideal of a politician. And I think it's a real shame. And I do think everyone should vote. And I think that sometimes we have to grit our teeth and vote for the best candidate for now. But to tell young people, go vote, when they don't see anything of their realities acknowledged, global warming, which is a direct and present threat to their existence and ours, the economy, healthcare, reproductive freedom, when these candidates can't even say something direct and honest, yeah, I'm not going to blame them for not voting. I'm going to say that we need to do better and give them better policies and candidates to vote for.
Allie, I think at this point, one of your favorite commentaries that I've seen has to do with when you were growing up in Canada with your family, and you were like 11 years old, and your father, Murad, is it?
Yep, that's right.
Ran for office. And it was a story that really illustrated the power of democracy. Will you tell people why?
I was 11 years old. My father had run to be a member of the provincial parliament in Ontario. It was 8 o'clock at night. The two of us had gotten in the car. We had quickly gone home. I was the best campaigner in the entire place. And the two of us had just gone home to freshen up. We were on our way back to the campaign office. The election had ended. We turned on the radio, and they announced the election is over. It's too early to tell what any of the results will be, except for in one constituency, which my father was running in, and they were able to announce that the guy against whom he was running had won. So, not a vote had been counted, and it was over. It was that clear that he was going to lose. And I was devastated. And I looked at my dad. It was just the two of us, and I said, I can't believe we lost. And he said, we were never going to win. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, we weren't going to win. There was no chance we were going to win. I said, why'd you run? He said, because I can. Because he grew up in South Africa, couldn't even vote because of the color of his skin. He came to Canada and he said, I'm getting involved and I'm going to run. And I've told this story before, and often someone, when I'm in Toronto, will get up and say, but you didn't tell the rest of the story. Your dad ran again and he won, and he broke a whole lot of glass ceilings. And my mother was a candidate, and my sister was a candidate for city council. But the biggest lesson in my life in politics is that he ran, he knew he was going to lose, he lost, and he understood that that was the participation in the political system that was his right and his obligation. And that is my response. You're right, Roxanne. We're not giving people the right candidates, so we need to maybe be the right candidates. We need to maybe find those right candidates. While we have the vote, use the damn vote and stop banning books.
Imani, you have two young sons, and I'm just curious, how do you deal with talking to them about this subject?
Well, my children, much in the way that I was, have spent their entire lives campaigning. Their father is an elected official, and they are out canvassing for him and for others as well. So civic responsibility is something that they have been socialized into from birth, and that is a family tradition, right? I mean, and I think about the fact that when my grandmother was my age, that was the age when I'm 50, right? Getting access to the right to vote finally. So it's very immediate, this feeling that it is a responsibility. But I also agree that, when King talked about in the movement and the right to vote, he also talked about in the North, the not being able to have something for Black people, having something to vote for. It is unconscionable that we have a system where oftentimes candidates are not responsive to their constituencies. And that's something that has to be called out consistently. And that also means that we have to demand something. As Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand. We can't be so worried about the other side that we don't demand things of our side that are quite explicit, and most importantly, that they represent our interests.
Ibram, you have just released a book called Magnolia Flower, which is a story that's been adapted by Zora Neale Hurston and has incredible illustrations. And it's about a young Afro-Indigenous girl who yearns for freedom. That's her spirit yearns for freedom. And it's something that your own daughter, who happens to be named Imani, will be reading at some point. You are very positive, at least in the interviews or the pieces that I've read about you. You think that this divided house can be repaired. How do you think we start to get there?
Well, let me just first add another layer to the discussion about young people voting. One of the reasons why young people aren't voting as much as older people is because young people are about twice as likely to move. And when you have a series of state registration policies that are distinct, that require you to re-register the vote, it makes it more likely that people who are constantly or more likely to be moving are going to be less likely to be registered. We also have studies that find that automatic voter registration leads to more young people voting. Same-day registration leads to more people voting. The decline in civic instruction in high school has been consistent with decline in young people voting. I'm mentioning all of this because I think it also answers your question, which is that we can think very deeply about why these inequities and injustices are happening or persisting, and figure out structural changes to ensure that we can create equity and justice for all. And we can believe that that's possible. My enslaved ancestors believed against all odds that the impossible, abolition, was possible. And they, of course, resisted for 250 years to make that happen.
Roxanne, I'm going to have Allie give the last word, but in terms of wrapping up what we've been talking about today, in that same piece I referenced at the top of the show, you did say that you felt, and you've sort of acknowledged it, that there still are ways that we have to transcend what we're going through now.
Absolutely. If we don't believe that, then we give into despair and nihilism, and that is such a luxury. And it's a luxury that the most vulnerable among us cannot afford. And so we have to stay committed. And it's not that we have the energy every single day, but we have to stay committed to this idea that there is a better reality that's possible, that we can make some of the necessary cultural change permanent and not subject to legislation. And so I just try to remind myself of that every single day. And some days are, of course, more successful than others. But we have a lot to be not hopeful about, because that requires sort of offloading the responsibility of actually creating change. But I think we can be positive that change is going to come, and it has before and it will again.
Thank you for that. And Allie, I am, because I think we may decide that we're going to draft you for some sort of office after this show today. You could join the family tradition. Everybody seems to have run in your family.
They all run.
What's the last word you want people to take away from this broadcast?
I so respect these views of my colleagues on this panel. I do think it becomes difficult if you are out there every day, as I am, preaching the dangers to democracy that we're facing. I mean, at some point I would turn the channel off. But there is a space in which we can exist where we can say our democracy is absolutely imperiled, and there are examples all around the world in which it can be lost, and yet we are strong and able to change that together. And so we need to do that. We need to practice critical thinking. We need to practice pluralism. We need to decide that there are ways in which we can engage, like Ibram talked about, but we can do it. And when we do it, we can change all these things that we don't like about guns, about climate, about voting rights, about reproductive rights. It can be done. It is still within our reach. We still have the ballot. So all of these problems can be overcome, but we do have to live with the discomfort that Roxanne talked about. It is uncomfortable. It doesn't look good some days. Some days it looks really scary on a very personal level and a national level, but it is our job to fix it, and we can do it.
You're definitely running. When it comes to wrapping up our broadcast on a hopeful note with a silver lining moment, nobody does it better than the children you're about to see. Here's what happens when a beloved Disney character, the Little Mermaid, is reimagined to provide a role model for little girls of color.
She's brown like me. She's a black girl. She's black! Mama, she's black! What? Oh. She's black! She's black! Yes, 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 yes!
Yeah, she's brown like you. We're gonna go see it when it comes out in the theater.
Yes!
Could watch that all day long. And that's our show for today. Again, we're grateful to our all-star panel and to you for joining us. Originally from the other Washington, Connecticut, now from Litchfield, Connecticut. Until we see you back here next time for Common Ground, I'm Jane Whitney. Take care.